To conclude this grim picture in regard to detention and torture, torture in its most awful forms has been systematically employed against Palestinians by both branches of the Palestinian Authority, the Fatah-dominated branch in Ramallah and the Hamas-dominated branch in the Gaza Strip. In many cases, tragically, by men who were themselves previously tortured by the Israeli security services. It is systematically employed as well by the security services of all the Arab states involved in this conflict, including states like Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, to all of which the United States under the Bush administration rendered detainees for the express purpose of interrogation under torture, with the CIA presumably collecting the information. Whatever they said, whatever they believed their interrogators wanted them to say, which is generally what you get under torture. In none of these places in the Arab world does the rule of law protect the individual from the most abusive actions of the state, whether with regard to torture or with regard to detention. Now, it is with relation to respect for international law and for the United Nations in looking at this conflict that there has been perhaps the most egregious departure from the new spirit that has characterized our presidential transition. One can read hundreds, nay thousands, of paragraphs in the newspaper of record and other papers in this country. One can hear thousands of words on American television and radio, and one can read years of official US government statements without once learning that Israel's 41-year occupation of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Gaza Strip, which is still technically an occupied territory in spite of the withdrawal of Israeli forces from it in 2005, and the Golan Heights, and all of Israel's settlements therein, in all of those territories, constitute violations of international law. You can go through acres of the New York Times. You can go through years of American official statements without a single reference to the fact that the occupation and settlements are violations of international law. They are specifically violations of the Fourth Geneva Convention, not to speak of numerous UN Security Council resolutions. Now, these are not minor matters. These legal principles are the bedrock of any serious attempt to resolve this conflict justly and permanently, which necessarily involves using international law. Ignoring these considerations means maintaining the essentially lawless approach to the Middle East, based primarily on accommodating Israeli power, that has largely characterized both media treatment and American policy under most of the most recent US administrations. Continuing with this approach, if we do so, will necessarily and inevitably lead directly to more violence and more suffering, primarily by innocent Palestinian civilians, as always, and will make much harder any later resolution of this conflict. As far as other aspects of international law, I will leave it to those more expert than I am to judge the extent to which Israel's use of force in Gaza has been proportionate, and this is the key term, in terms of its right of self-defense. Those of you who know anything about international law know exactly what I'm talking about. Those who don't, I can't explain it to you very well anyway. But self-defense has to be proportionate in international law. We'll be more expert in answering whether it has used weapons like white phosphorus artillery shells and mortar rounds in violation of the laws of the war. They can be used, but they cannot be used in populated areas. And whether its forces have behaved legally towards medical personnel and the civilian population. You perhaps know the casualty totals. One Israeli civilian was killed in the 6 months before December 27th, and 3 were killed during the subsequent 22 days of the war, in addition to 10 Israeli soldiers, 5 of them apparently by what is, again, a misnomer, friendly fire. Against that, approximately 1,300 Gazans were killed, most of them civilians. From a comparison of these casualty totals, 1,300 to 13, it seems clear that this conflict has been characterized by a grotesque disproportionality, unless we are operating according to a system of values whereby one Israeli life is worth 100 Palestinian ones, and relatively minor provocations, and I stress relatively, justify a bloodbath. From attacks on hospitals and ambulances, which are attested without any contention, and from reports of extensive attacks on civilians, the same disrespect for the laws of war seems to have operated. Since all of these things took place under an Israeli-imposed cloak of the absence of outside witnesses, forcibly kept away from the battlefield. I compare this to keeping witnesses away from the crime scene before the crime is committed. It's impossible to pronounce definitively on any of these alleged violations. One can only hope that serious investigations by impartial investigators will take place, that the facts will come out, and if it appears that crimes of war or other crimes have been committed, they will be subject to vigorous prosecution by whatever suitable bodies. And in case of convictions, they will be followed by exemplary punishments. We can hope, at least, for that. As regards the United Nations, I'm someone who has a particular respect for the United Nations. I went to the UN school in this city. I'm a graduate of the United Nations school. My father worked his entire career for the United Nations, and my brother works for the United Nations. I have many, many good friends who work for the United Nations, some of them who've died while serving the United Nations. And so I feel particularly strongly about what has just happened here. I can think of few recent instances of disrespect, contempt, and indeed active malice being directed against the United Nations, on a par with Israel's attacks on 4 United Nations schools and the main headquarters of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency in Gaza. That building was still burning yesterday from what are reported to be hits from 3 white phosphorus shells. The fire destroyed all their medical and food supplies. The GPS coordinates of all UN buildings in the Gaza Strip were provided to the Israeli military, and UN officials vigorously denied accusations that their facilities were being used for combat operations. These assertions and Israeli counterclaims must also be checked by impartial investigators, as the UN Secretary General has demanded, to determine whether in this case war crimes have been committed or not. The insidious propaganda campaign of Israel and those who purport to be its friends in this country, I don't think they really are friends of Israel, frankly, for in effect, against the UN, for in effect being complicit with terrorists, meanwhile poisons the atmosphere and may in fact constitute incitement, which is to say encouragement for further attacks on UN installations and personnel. I haven't seen the casualty total of UN personnel yet. What is crucial here, however, is not what the world as a whole thinks and does. Most people the world over had access to this alternate reality I've talked about, and they've already made up their minds as a result of seeing the images and hearing the unfiltered news out of Gaza during this lopsided conflict, which was more akin to shooting fish in a barrel than a real war. If it was a war, it was a war by one of the most advanced and powerful regular armies on the planet against a civilian population trapped in the 139 square miles of the Gaza Strip, which is in effect a giant sealed prison camp.